Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to Sci-Frights, the film discussion podcast from the interzone where horror meets science fiction. My name is Liam Dunn, and I am a screenwriter, film critic, and lifelong science fiction fan.
My name is Dr. Lindsay Hallam. I am a senior lecturer in film, and I am a specialist in horror cinema. So, what are we talking about today?
We're now in episode 4, and we're going to book ourselves in for an appointment with some diabolical surgeons as we investigate the very acts of the mad scientists themselves. So in this episode, we're going to travel back to the 1960s, and we're going to take a look at Georges Franju's deliciously macabre Eyes Without a Face and John Frankenheimer's Twilight Zone-esque sci-fi oddity Seconds.
So with this episode, we are looking at surgeons, following on in the vein of where we've been going since we've started this podcast of looking at the legacy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is where we see both genres of horror and science fiction originating from. So some of what we're talking about today directly relates to our second episode on Nutty Professors, where I talked about the advent of the mad science film. From the very beginnings of cinema as well, you had adaptations of Frankenstein and a lot of mad science films being made in the German Expressionist period, going into those 1930s Universal horror films as well, where you get the Hollywood version of Frankenstein. But we really wanted to focus in particular on this idea of surgery and the surgeon. So our first film is looking at the surgeon in particular, and our second film is looking at the person who, I guess, gets the surgery performed upon them. So when we talk about the mad science films, we have the figure of the mad scientist, and it's this whole idea of these people who see themselves as superior. They are like a god who is trying to improve humanity. So there is often this conservative aspect to the mad science narrative of this whole idea of warning humans of dabbling in God's domain. There are things that humanity is not meant to know. This whole idea of with knowledge comes punishment, which goes back to obviously Frankenstein, and then before that, the myth of Prometheus. So you have these mad scientists, and they're trying to improve the human, but in many ways, to improve the human, they in many ways become inhuman. Again, it's that whole idea of, with Frankenstein, of the monster being more human than the human creator. Well, I think about, like, with doctors, that whole thing of, like, when they go to university or medical school, they have to cut open corpses and cadavers, and this whole idea of what it must be like to be confronted with having to operate, to cut open people. You're doing that in order to save them, but there is this whole idea that they have to kind of overcome, I guess, not just the disgust, but just the fact of cutting someone open or experimenting with cadavers. There's obviously something that has to happen, I guess, cognitively for you to be able to do that. But you're doing that in order to save someone's life. But then you have the mad scientists, where often they are doing these experiments, some ways for their own gain, just to see if they can do it. I think about when in episode 2, when we looked at Reanimator, that whole thing of, like, Herbert West didn't care about the pain and suffering he was causing, or he wasn't even improving the people that he was operating on. He was just doing it just to see if he can and what he can learn from it. And so you have these perversions of science happening by the surgeon, by the doctor. And so it can be that they're doing that for knowledge, for personal gain, in some cases maybe even for their own sadistic pleasure. And then we have with Eyes Without a Face this idea of, trying these experiments in order to, in some senses, assuage guilt, or maybe it's all as an act of revenge. Then looking forward with Seconds, we have the perversion of science for monetary gain. There's the whole thing of corporatization and marketization that has happened with surgery. And I think then, of course, of the cosmetic surgery industry, which is all about exploiting people's perceived flaws or their weaknesses that they have about themselves, about their bodies, about their faces, about their looks. And this whole idea of fear of aging, which is probably linked to fear of death. And the whole idea of that aging is, it's inevitability. So you're never going to stop aging. So there's this constant cycle of making money because, people are trying to find the fountain of youth and they're never going to find it. And of course, ideas of perfection are constantly changing. So there's always something new to buy or to do surgically. And so a lot of films, especially quite recently, especially films directed by women, it's really interesting that they're kind of looking at that aspect of like cosmetic surgery and that whole kind of beauty industry. And I think most obviously of the film of last year, The Substance. So yeah, there has always been these different ways that surgery and the manipulation of the human body has been explored on screen. And I think these films, both the films we're talking about today, are very much set in the 1960s, very much of that time. So obviously, as with all great genre films, they're commenting on the time and place there which was made. One thing I mean, just thinking about you personally, Liam, I know that surgery on screen is something that you really, really have issue with. We watch the craziest, most heinous things on screen, but something about surgery gets to you.
Yeah, it gives me the heebie-jeebies, to be honest.
Why do you think it is? Do you have any ideas as to why? What is it about surgery that really you can't handle?
Well, I can watch a zombie eat entrails. I can watch someone get cut in half with a chainsaw and blood flying everywhere, and I find it entertaining. But surgery is just real. It's a real thing that happens. It's something that we kind of the shadow of it hangs over us all the time. Like at any moment we could be, in hospital having to undergo surgery. And it's that fear of death. It's the fear of mortality. It's the fear of having sort of your body violated, I suppose, in a certain way. Even though it is for your own good, it is to make you better, or at least to, help you get better in some way. But it's that being confronted with the reality of it, which just makes my skin crawl. Like, I really don't like looking at surgery scenes, even if they're obviously fake. Just the act of it just makes me cringe and not, and gives me the fear. Yeah,
I think it is just that thing of the inside of the body needs to be kept inside, and it is that source of a kind of disgust and that visceral feeling of like, just cutting open the body can really create a strong response and physical response in you when you're watching it on screen. I find a lot of surgery really quite fascinating because it is kind of seeing what we don't get to see and what we're all made of. Although I kind of feel like if I was actually there, I think for me, the idea of like smelling it would probably be the thing that would turn my stomach.
Ew.
That's the other thing, is that seeing the body being opened, it is something that your stomach turns. It really does create that involuntary response, which again maybe relates back to the fact that people who have to be surgeons or have to be doctors have to get over that in order to do their work. And so it's this whole idea of like, by getting rid of that response, is there also kind of other parts of kind of humanity that are being broken down or taken away as well?
I suppose, I think you finding it fascinating would be what someone going through medical school would need to have that as well. And I think they probably would, in pre-med or, in the early medical school, journey, there would be the point where you would come face to face with that, and either you can handle it or you don't. And then you either become a surgeon or you go off and become a psychiatrist or, do the theory or whatever. You don't do all of that. You become a GP, you do whatever. Like, it takes a certain kind of person to do that, and like to be a plastic surgeon as well, or a dentist even. Like, you want to be able to, you got to be okay, being a dentist, you got to be okay with sticking your hands in people's mouths all day long. I mean, And like going to talk about the diabolical surgeons that we're going to be talking about later on, I think. But you've got to have that something in you that wants to like crack open a person and start doing stuff. But then you also have your Hippocratic oath, which is at first do no harm. That you're supposed to be doing all of this in service of bettering humanity and making people healthier. And the people that we're going to be talking about in these movies are people who've abandoned that really, and they tell themselves that they justify it in their own way for whatever reason. And also, maybe not so much for Eyes Without a Face, but definitely with Seconds and another film I think we're going to talk about, which is that what's interesting is there's also the aspect of, at least at first, the patients themselves are seeking this transformation out. In some ways it's not being forced. The idea is not being forced on them. Maybe not, but there's this aspect of the idea of surgery being this gateway towards youthfulness or a new life or self-improvement.
Yeah.
But it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? That's where these cautionary tales come in.
Yeah, I always thought about this whole idea of like actually voluntarily having surgery. Just always was like, why would you do that? But then as I get older, things start happening like to my face. I wonder, like I totally am a sucker for like weird creams and all sorts of things, weird face treatments and stuff as I'm aging. And then I'm starting to see now that it's not much of a huge step to actually like want to surgically kind of alter my face as I get older, because I don't like it. But it's happening and it's an inevitability. But
and even you not even needing surgery these days. I mean, you can just take like with you talking about the substance. Like in Hollywood, everyone's obsessed with Ozempic. It's like a drug that you take in order to lose weight. So it's like there's even a pharmaceutical side of it as well, where you don't even need the surgery. You just get the drugs.
That's the thing. Yeah, it's all about making money. It's a whole industry that is exploiting what we hate about ourselves, and we're never gonna be okay. like you're never gonna think, oh yes, I'm perfect now, because then there's always a new trend. But shall we start with Eyes Without a Face?
Yes, let's get started. And also just another friendly reminder that we are spoiling these films. So if you haven't seen them, go check them out and then come and give this a listen and enjoy the discussion. Without further ado, this is episode 4 of Sci-Frights, Face Off.
Not since the cabinet of Dr. Caligari have critics been so enthusiastic. Never before have audiences been so terrified. Never again will you experience a tale of terror to compare with The Horror Chamber of Dr. Faustus. Here is a strange and fascinating motion picture that the London Observer compared with the ghastly elegance that often suggests Tennessee Williams in one of his more abnormal moods. A mature horror film that the Paris critics called worthy of the great horror classics of our time. Starring Pierre Brasseur as the depraved scientist who used beautiful women in the most frightening way imaginable. Alida Valli as the accomplice who procured the young girls he needed so desperately. Juliette Manuel as the innocent victim of a madman's perversity. The Horror Chamber of Dr. Faustus. Motion picture as fascinating as it is fantastic, as unusual as it is shocking, as frightening as anything you will ever see on a motion picture screen.
Eyes Without a Face, which was released in America as The Horror Chamber of Dr. Faustus. So the trailer that you would have just heard was for that release, but it is Eyes Without a Face. It's all about a surgeon, Dr. Genesier, who is kidnapping young women in order to take their faces and transplant them onto his daughter, Christiane, who is disfigured in a car accident that he actually caused. After successfully passing off one of his victims as Christiane, he continues his experiments with face transplants with the aid of his assistant Louise, who is actually also one of his former patients. So because all these young women are disappearing, there's an inspector who's looking for the murderer, and we see also that Louise is helping to lure the victims to the clinic where Genessier holds Christiane. We see her lure the next victim, and we see that we see Genessier taking the face off this young woman, transplants it onto Christiane, and we see at first it seems to succeed, but then after a while it starts to fail, and we kind of see that Christiane's face seems to kind of be rejected. Also, Christiane, she's very disturbed by her situation, and in many ways she almost doesn't want to continue to live because all these experiments keep failing. But also at the same time, she is quite complicit with her father's crimes. She does at one point try and call her fiancé Jacques, who thinks that she's dead. But then the call is intervened by Louise. The woman whose face was taken commits suicide. And so the inspector who's trying to find the murderer enlists a young woman called Paulette to go to Genessier's clinic and essentially be bait. Just as Genessier is about to perform surgery on Paulette, the police arrive and realize that he is the killer. Christiane manages to free Paulette. She stabs Louise, and she sets free all these animals that have also been kept as part of the clinic as well, these dogs and these doves. And Genessier is actually attacked by the dogs, and Christiane then just walks off into the nearby woods and Finn. So I absolutely love this film. It's always been a favorite of mine, and I really, really wanted to talk about this film. I've written about this film in articles. I also just recently did a video essay for the Umbrella release that's available now, that just came out within the past few months. But Liam, you had never seen this film until I basically forced you to watch it for this. So give us your thoughts.
This is one of those films that I've always wanted to watch for a really long time, and it's just, you never got around to it. So it was really good to finally get to see it, because yes, you talk about it all the time, and it's always brought up in a lot of conversations and on other podcasts and things, and it's fantastic. It's absolutely brilliant. I absolutely loved it. Fascinating sort of exploration on identity and on grief and shame, I thought. Yeah, and about, I guess, perception in a way of how we perceive the world, and what lengths we'll go to in order to help or protect our loved ones, but all done through this, I guess, horror movie story.
I think it was interesting that you say here, a horror story, because it's a French film, and when you think about other nations and their horror films, like there's a lot of nations such as, Great Britain, America, Italy, Japan. They all have this really strong history of horror cinema. France doesn't have as strong a tradition of horror cinema. If you go back to the very origins or the very beginnings of cinema, you do have Alice Guy, one of the first women filmmakers. She does do in the silent era a version of Faust and Mephistopheles. And then when you go into the surrealist period in the 20s, you can certainly see like Buñuel and Dali's film Un Chien Andalou has very horrific elements. One of the first images in that film is, of course, the eye getting cut with a razor. But then you don't really have a lot of horror films being made. You have some examples like Clouseau, who made like Le Diabolique, but he was working more, I would say, in the thriller genre than out-and-out horror. You have a couple of other examples like Blood and Roses by Roger Vadim, which is a version of the Elizabeth Bathory story, which is a version of Carmilla, a female vampire story. And then, speaking of female vampires, you have all the output of Jean Rollin in the 1970s. And you have Valerian Borovchik's film The Beast, which is this erotic fairy tale with, I guess, somewhat horrific elements to it. But yeah, the French horror films, they're much more romantic, much more erotic, and much more poetic. And poetic is a term that's used all the time when people talk about Eyes Without a Face. Once you get into the 90s, you have a couple of examples like Baby Blood and Man Bites Dog, which is actually Belgian, the work of Jeunet and Caro. And then, of course, once you get into the 2000s, you've got the new French extremity and a lot of French horror films that are really going hard, like High Tension and Martyrs and so on. But really what Georges Franju is doing with Eyes Without a Face is harking back to a more French tradition, which is that of the fantastique. And the fantastique dates back to the very beginnings of cinema, film, and the films of Georges Méliès. So you had the Lumiere brothers who, I guess you could say, invented cinema, the cinematograph. And the first films that they made were just the reality of the world around them, workers leaving the factory, train coming into the station. Méliès saw their film, saw the potential for magic, and so you have the beginnings of kind of this fantastic cinema of creating these magical, fantastical world. Georges Franju actually would go on to co-found the French Cinémathèque with Henri Langlois. And one of the first cine clubs that they ever programmed together was called La Cinéma Fantastique. So he's always been interested in this type of cinema. And in that program, it contained Gothic horror films, silent Gothic horror films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a 1927 film called The Cat and the Canary, and The Fall of the House of Usher, which actually Louis Buñuel worked as a assistant on that, although he didn't have a very good time. So this idea of the fantastique, Cathal Tohill and Pete Toombs, who do this amazing book called Immoral Tales, they talk about how the fantastic, the linear narrative and logic are always ignored in a fantastic film. The pictorial, the excessive, and the irrational are the privilege factors. If it does have a structure, it's the structure of a crazy dream, a dream full of potent, frightening, and sometimes inexplicable images. When you think about Eyes Without a Face, it definitely has that dreamlike quality to it, especially the ending, just as Christiane releases the doves and she just walks into the woods, which is this very kind of fairy tale-y kind of aspect to it. It also, that idea of dream logic, I think, goes back to the fantastique's connection also to surrealism. And Franju was actually acquainted with the leader of the surrealists, André Breton, and he admired Uncien Andalou. He was referred to as a bastard child of surrealism. But what's interesting is that Franju's first films were actually documentaries. And his most notable kind of early film is The Blood of the Beasts, which he made in 1949, which is set in a Paris abattoir. And so in that film, it's about, set at this abattoir, and it's this documentary footage of animal slaughter. So that in this abattoir, they slaughter horses to make horse meat. But what's really surprising about The Blood of the Beast is that it is this documentary film, but it has these touches of poetry and surrealism within it. And I think that really kind of, you could see that there's a clear through line, I think, from his documentary work into something like Eyes Without a Face, which also has that very clinical gaze, the fact that you've got this surgeon and there's this one, main scene of the film where you see this scene of surgery, you see the face transplant. So I think it's interesting, to think about this film, as a horror film, which, Franju didn't like the term, but yet you have these elements. You could also say the film's somewhat of a crime film as well. And there are these fairy tale elements as well.
I think that's what's so interesting about it, is that it has that the procedural elements, the medical elements, but yet he brings in that fantastical element as well to kind of to lift up things into a new sort of level, to a new level that with all of these different elements stacked on top of each other. I did read somewhere that people they thought they were disappointed by his move from documentary into this, and were kind of had a bit of a disconnect with that, and or that this sort of genre was below him or below, and I think he even said he wanted to make this genre be treated a bit more seriously. So maybe he was thinking about what people call elevated horror back in the late 50s, early 60s, about, well, I want to make a film that's seen as of the genre that people turn their nose up at, but I want to say, well, no, this stuff is good. It can be used to explore interesting themes and characters. And I also read that he was at the whim of all the censors in the different nations and I don't know if you're going to talk about that, but
we can hear our cat Angelo meowing next door. I don't know if you can hear him.
It was something I've read somewhere, that the French censors didn't want too much blood, the English didn't want animals getting tortured, and mad scientist characters would upset the Germans, or something to that effect.
Yes, and that was like, all of those are elements of this film. So it's like, yeah, what are you going to do? Definitely, I think that the fact that first program that he ever curated was these fantastique films. You can see that he always wanted to, for want of a better word, kind of elevate these films and have these films be seen as, I guess, important, or this whole kind of merging, I think, with that you see with Eyes Without a Face, and a lot of the kind of poetic horror that you get in the 60s and 70s, these merging of high and low elements that you have working in this genre that's seen as low. And the fact that it was totally seen as a step down from his documentary work. I believe even Jean-Luc Godard said something to that effect. And that you have these really shocking scenes of surgery and murder, but then also this overwhelming feeling of sadness and melancholy throughout the film as well at the same time. That I guess it goes back to the fact that Genessier is doing this because he's guilty. He's the one that is responsible for what happened to Christiane. So he's doing this in some ways. He's doing this to try and save his daughter, to make up for what he did. But yet also at the same time, you can tell that he's also doing these experiments because he wants to, find out if he can do it. Yeah. That there is maybe some hubris there, or
What I like about, one of the aspects I like about this film is how also it drops you right into this situation. I think if it were to be made today, there'd be you would watch it from like their father-daughter happy times, then the accident happens and his guilt and his shame that leads him to do this, or there'd be this lengthy flashback. But no, you're just left to, it's almost another aspect of this film. It's like a mystery that you have to piece together just from what the characters are doing, and it leaves you wondering, like, who were these people like before this accident? Was he always had this in him, that was he already doing experiments? He already has all these dogs, like that I don't know if he was doing some kind of experiments with them because he keeps them all in cages and things. Did he always have this in him? Is it the grief and the shame of his daughter's accident that has driven him to this? And also Christiane is sort of going along with it for a while, almost like, because she's got no face and she wants a new face, but her journey is this, like, but she has to look, and it's not explicitly stated, I don't think, but she's I guess fearful that she's going to be looking in the mirror and seeing this mask that she's got to wear, so she wants to have a new face. But then if she's looking in the face of a girl who was killed in order to have that face, like, what's that going to do to her in her entire life as well?
There is a really interesting line where she says, "My face frightens me, my mask terrifies me even more."
Yeah. So, and I think there's a changing of the face, changing, like, what is it? It's our face is our identity. And I think both films explore this nature of identity, and what happens to our psyche when we can't see either we can't see who we are anymore or used to be, or when we now look, we see somebody different. I think there's a psychological disorder, like where when you look in the mirror, you don't see yourself. I looked it up as depersonalization, derealization disorder, which also links to like body dysmorphia and all of these things, of when you look in the mirror and you don't recognize who you are anymore. And I think Christiane feels consumed by the accident and her disfigurement and her father's guilt. And in some way she may feel that they're going through this horrible situation to regain some sense of normality. But she kind of creates a new identity through this experience by not accepting it in the end. She kind of forges a new identity through her moral code. Like her father's abandoned his moral code. He's abandoned the Hippocratic Oath, like I mentioned before. And so it's like, just because she thinks she might look like a monster, it doesn't mean she has to be a monster. And I think she comes to that she regains a new person, a new agency, a new personality, even a new reason to live, even if she's just wandering off into the woods at the end to become some almost, maybe in the quote unquote film to come after this, there'd be people whispering about the woman in the woods, like as some kind of urban myth.
Yeah, and this whole idea of complicity with Christiane that I think is really quite complex in the film. That she says, I think, to Louise at one point, and I think even to her father, like, please just let me die. Like she knows that these other young women are being killed to try and get her face back. So she knows that murders are being committed. She knows of all the experiments. It's the fact that there are these dogs that Genessier is keeping, that he's testing on them. I think at one point you can see that he's got this dog asleep on a operating table, and I think you even see like there's a patch of the fur on the dog that is different, that he's obviously transplanted some part of another dog onto this dog. So yeah, there's this whole thing of he's doing. So it really is awful that he's obviously doing like these animal experiments, which is really really awful. And the fact that you have the barking of the dogs often in the background, and I think a lot of this film I really feel seems to hark back to World War II and feelings of guilt and shame within France. And you mentioned before how the censors were like, in Germany, they didn't want any mad scientist creatures, basically mad scientist narratives or characters, because it was reminding them of like Nazi doctors. So they didn't want that. And yeah, I think Genessier is definitely referencing all those awful experiments that the Nazis were doing. At one point, one of the dogs that's brought to them is a German Shepherd. And the fact that Genessier's fate is is to be mauled to death by these dogs. I'm always like, yeah, get him at the end. But it definitely, I think, harks back a lot to the medical experimentation that happened within World War II. And this idea of, that people around the concentration camps knew that they were there and just ignored it, just like Christiane is doing. This whole idea of the mad scientist, I think post-World War II, this figure of the mad scientist just becomes completely linked to the atrocities and trauma of that war. So you have the fact that Genessier is the one who was guilty of the accident that caused his daughter to be disfigured, and there's the beginning of near the beginning of the film where one of the victims their corpse is found, and he goes to the police station and he identifies this corpse as that of Christiane. And there's this other the man there who's the father of the actual victim. And he's there, and so Genesio basically runs into him and he's basically, said that this corpse that is, the daughter of this other man is his daughter. And when he talks to the other father, he's really unemotional. And I think he even says at one point, why am I the one who's comforting you? You still have hope. And it's like, but he doesn't have hope. You killed his daughter. It's just so cruel, that scene of what Genesio is doing there. And I think, in terms of, French collaboration, there was guilt and shame connected to that. That there was this national reckoning that was happening after World War II in France with their complicity and their collaboration. And there was this denial of that complicity. And Henri Rousseau, a historian, called the myth of resistentialism, which is this whole idea that most of France was identifying itself as part of the French resistance. And it was like, well, you all couldn't have been part of the resistance. Like, some of you were collaborating. And of course, after World War II, there was a lot of trials about trying to project everyone's guilt onto certain individuals who could kind of embody the shame. And of course, the people who were chose to embody that shame were usually women. The women who were with German men, Nazis who were there. There were public, parades of these women who, very publicly had their head shaved. And it's this whole, they were basically taking on everyone's guilt. And then you have, it's interesting then that you have Christiane, who has, no faith, that she also is kind of scarred, or something has happened to compromise her beauty. So I find that there is, I feel like there's a lot of World War II stuff in this film. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Well, definitely. I think, there's something to be said about the film. The films that we're looking at today are from the 60s, and I think that's a very important period in a lot of cinema around the world, of especially of those countries that took part in World War II or were affected directly by it, because this is the 60s now, where all the people who survived the war are now having their own children, which will be the baby boomer generation, and are reflecting back on that period, because we're about 1960s, about 15 years after. It's not that long ago. I mean, 15 years ago now was 2010. I mean, it's and there was this aspect of wanting to just move on, when it's, how do you can't just move on from those sorts of events. So I think there's a lot of that being worked out in films, and I think that there's also an aspect of the way the doctor is just experimenting on these women and discard, just taking off their faces and then dumping the bodies. And you would think about all the just the piles of corpses you would have seen, that people would have seen through the war, soldiers and civilians alike, and just the act of just feeling like everybody's just disposable, everyone's just chattel, that there's no humanity anymore, people just being discarded in the streets, and just life being worth nothing. It would just really do a number on you.
And then also, when you think about, also at the time of the film was made, France was at war with Algeria. So as you go into the 60s, you have all these countries throughout Africa fighting for their independence. So in Algeria, they were fighting from their independence from French colonialism. And the year before the film came out, there was this well-known book by Henri Alleg called The Question, and he details in that book his torture at the hands of the French military. And more than one commentator has kind of said that a lot of Alleg's accounts don't seem that dissimilar from what you see in some scenes with Eyes Without a Face. So we also think back to, you know, the fact that horror is so looked down upon, but yet you can find in these films, because, you know, there was such restrictive censorship at that time that you could not do any direct commentary like on the Algerian War that was happening as, you know, as the film was made. But through, you know, genre, through horror or science fiction, through subtextually, you were able to actually deal with what was actually happening, or have some critique there, and it's somehow able to kind of pass through, because not everyone's going to get it. So, you know, the fact that, you know, France was dealing with the after effects and the guilt of their collaboration, at the very same time they were still committing atrocities. They were, you know, they were colonizers. And they were, you know, and all of the atrocities that come with colonization, they were being, again, confronted with that. So I also see that I think is also at play within this film, I kind of feel. And I guess following on from that, we have to talk about the surgery scene, the scene.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yuck.
Yeah. How were you with that scene?
I was all right. It's not so bad as when you see someone getting their chest cut open and their organs being removed and things. I thought it was really, really effectively done. Like I was actually trying to see how they did it, because it's quite. They do it so almost in one shot. You see the carving and the blood coming out, and it looks quite realistic, I reckon, in like, well, at least it's done in that kind of cold clinical way, that it's quite effective. You know, maybe not realistic, but effective. And it did make me squeamish, which I think is its intent. And you just feel really sorry for her, and just profoundly sad by the whole situation of that this is what it's got to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the special effects in that I thought were really, really good for, because you think at the 1960 how good are the VFX going to be, and you know, this is why physical effects are always better than computer effects, because you can actually get that tangibility to it.
And yeah, so it mostly plays out mostly in wide shots. So yeah, when you think about this idea of like a clinical gaze upon it all, and I think this is where his Franju's documentary background comes into play, that it's mostly wide shots, quite long takes, so you're really seeing it in excruciating detail. You see, you know, it starts off with they're kind of using a pencil to outline around her face, and then very methodically kind of cutting around the face, and then doing the clamps, and there's no music.
Yeah.
All you hear is the sound from within the scene, which is, you know, quite quiet. So it's all presented very plainly, like we are maybe like we're medical students, you know, in watching within an operating theatre. And so when the film first came out, there were reports of people fainting.
Dropping like flies is the term I've read.
Yeah. Apparently there was a screening in Scotland where someone fainted, and Franju said something like, "Oh, now I know why men wear skirts," or something like that.
Right, George.
But you know, it's interesting that this the most horrific scene in the film is basically a scene of surgery that happens all the time.
Yeah.
And it's actually interesting. So when Franju was interviewed for television, I think he must have been asked, like, what's the scariest film he ever saw? And his answer was a medical film titled Trepanation for Epileptic Seizures.
Yeah.
So trepanning is where they basically drill a hole, isn't
Yeah.
it? You drill a hole into someone's head. And he explains, he says that people were fainting in their seats because it was done very scientifically. And so the whole thing, like, by having it done so coldly and unemotionally, in some ways heightens the emotion for the viewer. And Franju stated that, what makes it truly horrific is that the viewer's suffering is not shared. So I guess he's kind of saying that, you're seeing this surgery take place. And so obviously when surgery usually happens, the person is anesthetized. So they're pretty much asleep. So they're not showing any emotion, but all this awful stuff is happening to them. But us watching it, we're feeling that pain almost and that revulsion. And so it's this whole idea of like you could say like the lack of affect on screen increases our visceral kind of physical response to what we see. I don't know. Do you vibe? Do you vibe with that? Do you think that's
absolutely? I mean, I think there's also an aspect of you don't get invited to go into surgeries and watch while they're being happened all the time, do you? It's like it seems it's this hidden world only accessed by the professionals. And if you're involved, like you said, if you're involved in it, you're under anesthetic and you're not. Even if you've got a local, they put a big sheet up so you can't see what they're doing because nobody wants to see themselves getting operated on. But if you're ever involved, you're never a part of it. You're the subject of whatever's going on. So to actually see it happening, and the clinical nature of it, it's not editorializing it. It's not. If it were done in, that's why I think I can watch horror movie scenes in any other context because there'll be the music, there'll be screams, there'll be people running around, and it's almost a filmmaker saying, "This is horrific, isn't it?" And then you're like, "Yes, it is," and let's experience this together, and either we're frightened or we're laughing or whatever the emotion is that the filmmaker wants from you, but presenting it in this clinical way. It's taking that away from you. It's taking that safety net away, and you're just left with what is happening. And I think leaving it in the long shots, I don't think if audiences were already fainting watching that, close-ups would have just been like, it would have been banned or something. I don't know, and the censors would have just gone nuts. So I think pulling back also allows the access, even though it's still really tough to watch. And also thinking about what you're saying, where it goes on so long and he's drawing what he's going to, because there's also the anticipation and the setup and payoff where he's drawing on what he's about to do, and you're just going, oh no, oh no, oh no, and then he's doing that. And also I think that it leads into the character of him, of how he's pouring himself into the procedure of it in order to distance himself from what he's actually doing. By following each step to the letter, he can convince himself that this is all an experiment and that there's not actually a person's life at stake or a person's face or what have you. So it works on that level of the affect or the experience of it as well as the character.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that when you think about most horror scenes where there is the lead up, and then, when someone's attacked with a knife or whatever, it's this huge scream happens from the victim, and and lots of noise and thing, and that sequence is so completely quiet, and it's just quiet, and people are just going about and kind of doing their job. And it's interesting to think that the film was released in 1960, so it comes out within a year of two other seminal horror films that kind of changed horror forever, which was Michael Powell's Peeping Tom and Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. And when you think about, of course, what's the most famous scene in Psycho is the shower scene, and the whole thing of like you have the lead up, and then and then it's the scream and that's quick editing, screeching soundtrack. It's the exact opposite of the scene in Eyes Without a Face, which is kind of really interesting. And also it's quite incredible that within that year, those three films come out. So you got Peeping Tom from Britain, Psycho from America, Eyes Without a Face from France, and of course Psycho becomes the big hit. Peeping Tom pretty much ends Michael Powell's career. Yeah. Everyone's completely kind of repulsed by that film. Eyes Without a Face, the response to that wasn't great. I think it had a couple of somewhat positive reviews, but he's kind of stepped away from his earlier work, which was seen as much better. His work in documentary. And the same thing happened with all the filmmakers from the German Expressionist period. When they went over to Hollywood, they made film noir. That was seen as a step down from what they were doing beforehand. But yeah, by going into genre and things, it's always seen as this step down.
Is it the equivalent of Dylan going electric?
Yeah, maybe, yeah. And it's interesting that when it was released in America, it was released under the title The Horror Chamber of Dr. Faustus, and it was in a double bill with the film called The Manster. And parts of it were cut out. Like that surgery scene, I believe, was cut out quite a bit as well. And also, so you have that within that year, 1959 to 60, those three, landmark horror films. But also within France, within that year, you have the beginning of the French New Wave. So over the course of 59-60, you have the debut films from, I think Claude Chabrol made 2 films. And then, of course, you have Francois Truffaut's The 400 Blows and Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless, which, of course, changes everything, changes the face of French cinema and even, like internationally cinema, sets off all these new waves that happen all around the world. Truffaut and Godard and all the, a lot of the French New Wave filmmakers, they started out as writers for Cahiers du Cinéma, a magazine that was really notable for reevaluating a lot of, especially like horror, especially a lot of Hollywood films that were also looked down upon. So Francois Truffaut wrote an article, A Certain Tendency in the French Cinema, where he was basically railing against the older generation of French filmmakers, which he felt were just basically transplanting the screenplay onto the screen, and they weren't actually putting any of themselves into the film. And he saw that as very different to a lot of films, especially that he was seeing from Hollywood, that were made within this very kind of regimented studio system, but yet there were some filmmakers like Hitchcock, like Orson Welles, like Fritz Lang, who came from Germany, who were able to imbue their own worldview into their films. And it's this whole idea of the auteur, that the director is the one who is the main author of the film. So this idea of the auteur theory comes a lot from Truffaut and the writers of Cahiers du Cinéma. And so Truffaut actually interviewed Franju for the magazine, and he apparently even visited the set of Eyes Without a Face. But then, when the film came out, I believe that, Jean-Luc Godard did say some kind of disparaging things about the film. So in some ways, in relation to those French New Wave films, Eyes Without a Face did seem like this, it's completely out of step, because, especially like with 400 Blows, very kind of realist film. And Breathless as well, shot on the streets, location shooting. And, the poetic style of Franju seemed completely kind of out of step. So it was, in some ways, I guess you could see it rejected as being part maybe of that kind of older style of French cinema. But yet, I think in terms of the genre, I think we now can kind of see it as a landmark film. And I think a lot of it is because of how it manages to fuse these high and low kind of cultural elements within it. I think it's just such a amazing, important film.
So, and how important is it nowadays, do you think? How do you think it's endured over the years since its release?
I think, immediately in the aftermath of the film's release, it's interesting that we're looking at films in the 60s, that there are a lot of films that are very similar. So immediately after it was released, even though maybe it didn't, I don't think it even really did that well. It didn't have a great, critical response, but yet it did influence a lot of films made in the 60s around the world that were basically telling the exact same story. So In 1961, in Italy, you have Atom Age Vampire, which it's not really a vampire film. It's a guy who's I've watched it a while ago. It's not great. It's really not good. It's a scientist doing these experiments, and it's the whole thing of to do with kind of nuclear bomb threats and the whole idea of the atom age and radiation and things that you can do with that. In 1962, you have The Witch's Mirror, which was made in Mexico, kind of a Mexican Gothic film, and there's a lot of occult elements in that. It's a mother sees her daughter's death foretold in this kind of enchanted mirror, and she's killed by her husband, who's a surgeon, and then when he gets a new wife, she ends up being disfigured, and he transplants her hands and face, but they're also being haunted by the first wife. So it's all very much more kind of occult and fantastical. Then in 1962, you have The Awful Dr. Orloff, directed by Jess Franco.
Oh, your boy.
Yes, I do have a fondness for Jess Franco, who made 200 odd films over the course of his career.
And he made this film twice, didn't he? Or a very similar sounding film.
Yeah, so he did Awful Dr. Orloff in 1962. He also does a film called Faceless in 1988, which it is interesting to look at Faceless because it's very 80s, very, very 80s. His character of Dr. Orloff shows up in other films that he makes over the years. The Awful Dr. Orloff that's the thing with Franco, is there's a real scrappiness to his films, but I just find them really kind of weirdly charming. But in that, he also leans in, I think, to the more kind of almost sadistic aspects of the surgeon character. I also found out there was a film in 1968, a British film called Corruption, starring Peter Cushing, which I have not seen. So just within the decade after its release, there are all these films, and we'll talk about some more in a bit when we talk about Seconds, about this idea of face transplants and things like that. I think also, you mentioned the whole idea of elevated horror. This whole idea of horror being kind of blended with what you might call art cinema. This whole idea of art horror, I guess you could say, definitely goes back to Eyes Without a Face and what Georges Franju was doing. So I think over the years it's definitely become a classic. And then, of course, in 2012, you had Pedro Almodovar making The Skin I Live In, which is, owes a lot to Eyes Without a Face, in that you've got a father who's using his surgeon abilities to pretty much enact this very elaborate plan for revenge. I definitely think it has grown in stature over time, and I think now it is very much a key film. And
we also can't forget Billy Idol's seminal song.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Also, I read somewhere that John Carpenter even said when they did the mask for Michael Myers for Halloween, he has said that it gave him Eyes Without a Face vibes, like the mask that Christian wears, which is basically eyes, nose, mouth, but completely blank. Yeah. Although his is a Captain Kirk mask that they bleached, but
yeah,
he saw William Shatner's dead eyes and thought, "There we go, that's what we want."
Yeah. So I think we can move on, but amazing film, and I hope people really do get out there and watch it. So shall we move on now to Seconds? So Liam, tell us about Seconds.
Bold, bizarre, terrifying. Rock Hudson, in an astonishing change of pace, stars in Seconds. Rock Hudson as a second, freed from all responsibilities, now ready to taste new pleasures. Rock Hudson, as a man who buys for himself a totally new life, a chance to begin again. Every man's dream since time began.
As soon as these people leave, I'm going to attack you. I want you to know that.
I'm counting on it.
Rock Hudson, as a man who lives the nightmare of being a second.
Why are you all staring at me like that? Hey, John. Hey, John. Hey, John. Why are they staring at me like that?
They know.
They know what?
They're like you. Reborn.
Oh, Laura!
Yes, so Seconds is was made in released in 1966, directed by John Frankenheimer. It's the third film in what is referred to as his paranoia trilogy, which people say begins with The Manchurian Candidate in 1962, which is one of my favourite films of all time, and then continues on to 7 Days of May, which is a military thriller with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas, and then Seconds. But Seconds feels like a completely different film to the other two, even though they share a lot of the similar themes. So Seconds follows Arthur Hamilton, played by John Randolph, who lives a rather humdrum existence in his grey flannel suit, working 9 to 5 in a bank in New York City, which he then takes the train home to see his wife in their empty nest, their children having grown up and left the house. And he seems, bored and annoyed with his job, bored and annoyed with his wife. He seems to have got it all, got the American dream, but he's completely dissatisfied with everything. But in the opening moments of the film, he's followed by a mysterious man through the train station and offered some information, a phone number, which he goes to his study in a quiet moment to call, and ends up talking on the phone to his friend Charlie, who, up until that point, he thought had died. But he proves to him that he is his friend, and then tells him to go to a place for a meeting. So when he goes to this place, for a mysterious place for a meeting, he learns that there is this shadowy corporation that is offering second chances to candidates who feel that they want a new start at life. They give you a new name, a new face, a new physique, and a new pursuit, and a whole new house, location, everything, for anybody who wants it. But they also set up a whole system by which he has no way to refuse once he signs up. They drug him, they hypnotize him, they film him in flagrante delicto, almost, with a mysterious woman, as if to create some blackmail materials in order to force him to go into the surgery. So he goes in, he's transformed, and he comes out the other side as Rock Hudson, who is now known as Tony Wilson. Through hypnosis, Arthur said he maybe in another life wanted to be a painter, so they tell him, you're a painter now. You live in this house, you've got a whole new life, go for it. The world is your oyster. And this seems like, at first, like it could be a new lease on life, a paradise where he can now live out his fantasies. And while living out in his house near the beach, he runs into a woman named Nora, who seems like this free spirit, almost this hippie woman who is offering him a new experience and a new way of seeing life, which seems to unlock things in Tony, which allow him to get over the first few hurdles of his reluctance. But then as he goes on about his new life, he realizes everyone around him is either another reborn, as they call it, or they work for the company, even discovering that Nora is herself an employee of this mysterious company. So Tony ends up realizing that this new lease on life, this new dream life that he could be living is another lie. It's another fabrication. It's another, there are even more rules than there were before. Again, he is trapped in a life that he doesn't want. So he goes back to the company and asks for another change of face. He wants to start again. Now that he knows how it all works, how it's all supposed to work, he wants another chance. And at first he has to go and wait his turn. And he runs into Charlie, his friend again, who is then taken away, told that he's going to get to have another go at it. These people all in this waiting room who obviously haven't taken to their new life, but are being offered another chance, or offered a chance to be on the waiting list to try it again, try for a third act, I suppose. And then eventually they tell Tony that he can come through and he is ready for his next go around. But he soon learns that instead of being given a new face and a new name once again, he's going to be used as turned into a dead body to help fake the death of the next candidate who's coming through. Roll credits.
Yes, so we first watched this film several years ago. I think it was when we were back in Australia, so over a decade ago. And for as long as I've known you, I've known that Manchurian Candidate is absolutely one of your favourite films ever. Mm-hmm. We watched Seconds the first time. You weren't so into it.
No.
And you had a really different response watching it again. So I don't know if you've kind of taught... What do you think about why did you not like this film as much the first time you've watched it, and what changed?
I just think I had different expectations for the film the first time around. Manchurian, because it's still a film of the 60s, a later 60s, but it's almost like an art movie, Seconds is, as opposed to Manchurian Candidate is this sleek, big budget thriller with big, it's got Frank Sinatra in it. It's all very glossy and glamorous, even though it's weird as hell as well. And Seconds just seemed like more impressionistic and more, surreal. I just know it wasn't what I was expecting going in, and I kind of fought against it a little bit. And having not seen it in a long time and coming back to it for this, I'm a little older, I'm a little wiser. And I think it just speaks a lot to me about things that you think about as you grow older, and about the choices that you made in life, and the things that you things that you wonder what there is to look forward to, or coulda, woulda, shouldas of everything. And also just more as I learned a lot more about the Cold War and about the cinema of that period, which is a big thing for me, which I find very fascinating, and Hollywood and America at that time. It really came together for me. And also just it's a very bleak story, which I like bleak stories. I like big shock endings like the one that this one has. And also it's very Twilight Zone, which I find interesting, considering Rod Serling wrote the screenplay for 7 Days in May, the previous film in this so-called trilogy. But this one actually feels like it could have been an episode of that TV show. Yeah,
I mean, I remember when I first watched it, I liked it, but it was something about watching it again and again. I don't know if it is because we're a bit older or, it just really floors you, I think. It really is, like you say, very, very bleak, and a really, really unhappy kind of downbeat ending, but really just very downbeat and critical, I think, of America of the time. So it's a very 1960s film. And you mentioned how, that a lot of what your interests are in is to do with the Cold War and how that played into, the cinema, especially of like the 1960s, and the fact that you love the Manchurian Candidate so much. And you mentioned this whole idea of like what's his name? Arthur Hamilton. Yeah. So the first guy, our original guy, is Arthur Hamilton. They say at one point, I think he's 51 years old. And you mentioned how, he is the man in the grey flannel suit. So this film comes out in 1966, and you think about, like, I guess the man in the grey flannel suit. I mean that's comes from the novel. But the whole idea of the man in the grey flannel suit typifies, it is very much this post-World War II man. And so, because I know in the original novel, the man in the grey flannel suit, he was in World War II. And I was thinking, like, if Arthur Hamilton is 51 in 1966, he would have been in, like, his late 20s World War II. So they never say whether he... I don't think they ever say if he served or not. But my assumption is that he probably served in some way in World War II. And, you know, the 1950s, we have in our mind that view of like 1950s America, which is where everyone, you know, moved to the suburbs, had 2.5 children, white picket fence type of thing, and appliances and, buying stuff, television and so on. And it's clear that Arthur bought into this, or at least was, that he bought into it, or that he thought, well, this is what I'm supposed to want. And now he's 51 years old. You see his wife, like, there's a scene, it's really awful, like, again, excruciating scene with his wife where you can see that, well, they have separate beds. And there's this one point at night where his wife gets out of her bed and sits on his bed, and they kind of kiss, and then it just nothing happens, and you can see, it gives you an insight into this is what. And I think she says later that it was like this basically celibate. They're, you know, and it's just, it's obviously just this really, like, they're both just going through the motions. They were told this is what they were supposed to have or supposed to want, and it's just. You know, and now I think they've got a daughter who's an adult, so it's not even like taking care of a child. It's just like they've got nothing now. They've got everything that they were supposed to want, and they don't want it. Yeah.
And, you know, because the whole World War II thing it's never directly addressed. I think it's just something that I think they expect the viewer to, at the time when it first came out, the viewer would be it would be implicit. The viewer would kind of understand that it is kind of a result of GIs coming back from the war and being given these. It's like this collective, like, let's forget about that and let's go. Look, you know, everything we won, it's all good. Let's just like get your white picket fence and your 2.3 children and go live in the suburbs and go work in the bank and it'll all be fine. And let's not deal with any of that. And because I remember hearing a historian talk about how when the war is over. You know, sure, the Germans, French, Italian, you know, all the people in Europe would have PTSD, but when and you know, things they had to deal with. But when the war was over, and it's like, okay, everybody go home. They you know, don't have very far to go back to their home country, whereas Americans have to go, you know, back to France, then get on a boat and then travel. And in that whole time, they're sort of only with other GIs. They've got this whole time to kind of. It all percolates and it all starts to, like, they have this time to reflect on it and it settles in, and then they get back to America where everyone's pretending that it never happened because they're all over there and they don't know what went on. So there's this PTSD element that's not dealt with, and that gets brought out in this ennui, this feeling of something's missing. This isn't what this is not what, when I was in my 20s, before I went off to war, this is not how I saw my life becoming. But then the World War II ends and then the Cold War basically begins a year later or whatever, or immediately after. And suddenly there's this new enemy that is kind of this giant shadow that's hanging over everything. And how do you delineate America from the Soviets? Well, Soviets all about control, and there's the quote unquote, you know, the collective, and then in America it's all about the individual, but yet there's all these strictures and rules put in place by society that's, you know, it's not authoritarian, but it's this nefarious rules and restrictions just from the way you're supposed to behave and the way you do this, you do that. Like even you know, I wonder if the separate beds thing was actually, I mean, it shows that their relationship, because it starts with them cutting back and forth as if they're actually in bed together, and then it shows the separate beds. I don't know if even the censors at the time in films, they had to show people in separate beds. I don't know, but there's this kind of Puritanism. There's this
repression. Everything's so repressed.
Everything's repressed, and that's where you get these characters who feel that they've got. If only they could start again, they could have another go at it, and they could get rid of their life, and they could have this new life and they could do whatever they like. But then this company shows up and says, well, we can give that to you for a price. But then they have all these rules too. And there's actually, this whole idea of quote unquote freedom comes with its own price. And so again, you're even more trapped, because not only is there you've changed one set of rules for another. And so there's never, the only freedom is death. Is kind of what the film ends up saying at the end.
But then it also makes me think of, like, when you're saying this idea of, I guess, all these rules being put in place. When you think about, in particular, I think about the 1950s, it's also this time of mass conformity. And if you think about, like, I think 1956 was the invasion of the body snatchers. And in that's about people being replaced. And they become these very, like, they've got no emotion. And that means that they're, now this alien and not human anymore. And of course, everyone has talked about how the invasion of the body snatchers is this Cold War allegory, and how that, in one way you could say it's all about this commentary on, like, in the Soviet Union, you have to give up your individuality to be part of, like, the mass collective. But actually, I kind of feel like that film was critiquing the mass conformity that you had to follow in America. Like, the whole thing of, like, you could not be seen if you were out of line, then you were a communist, or you were against the state. Everyone needed to conform. And I think a lot of it was repressing what happened in World War II, and I guess the whole thing of the nuclear threat the whole time. And you would have to, I guess, repress that fear. Otherwise, you would just go insane with thinking that at any moment the nuclear bomb could be dropped on you and, like, the world could end. So it's interesting to think about Seconds, like, as a continuation kind of like the sci-fi horror that was happening, like, with alien invasion films, or and also like the place of the film within this trilogy. And it's a paranoia trilogy, and the paranoia is all linked to the paranoia everyone was feeling in the Cold War. So I don't know if you kind of want to talk about how does this film sit within this trilogy, because it is really different. Like, I can see the connections to the Cold War much more in The Manchurian Candidate and 7 Days in May. How is it still there in Seconds? Or what are your kind of thoughts about Seconds within the Cold War kind of narrative?
I think it's actually, I would call the trilogy of the free will trilogy, because it's actually exploring what the idea of free will, especially in a modern society. So Manchurian Candidate's all about, it's about brainwashing. And, there's this Raymond Shaw is a singular person whose mind is controlled in order to become an assassin at will, when triggered. But then there's also the whole idea of this mass brainwashing of the communist witch hunts and anti-communist fervour of the time. And then in 7 Days in May, it's about a general who doesn't like what the president's doing, so he plans a coup. The general's so sure that he's right that he will not be dissuaded from this, and he wants to impose his order on America, and thereby, and the president says to him, like, you don't like what I'm doing, stand for election and get voted in, because that's, you would think we're a democratic society, we rely on the body politic. You can't just impose your will on people and have it be be an authoritarian and have your will trump everybody else's. And so I think Manchurian Candidate has that bit of that political and the personal. 7 Days in May is very much just about, like, the political aspect of it, but then Seconds, I think, is the personal part of it, where it shows how American society is forging itself as a antithesis to communism, and it's this kind of lie agreed upon that we're all free individuals allowing ourselves to act the way we want, but there are actually all these invisible laws around that are and just the way you're supposed to act, and a way a red-blooded American man is supposed to be, and things like that. And also to think about that in 1966, the Vietnam War is going on, and that's being beamed into homes, onto television, which is a mass entertainment tool being used to spread the truth about what's really going on. So there's nowhere to hide from that. So how do you come to terms? How do you reckon with this American exceptionalism that we're the good guys with what's going on in Vietnam?
And people would have been seeing for the first time ever on television what it really is to be, in war, and the atrocities that were being committed in the name of the American people. Yeah. People would have been confronted with that, I think, probably for the first time.
Yeah. And I think there's I've got this book here, The Covert Sphere, Secrecy, Fiction and the National Security State by Timothy Millie. And he mentions there's actually a thing in 1967, a year after Seconds, there was a march on the Pentagon over Vietnam War. It was an anti-Vietnam War march. And Norman Mailer wrote about it. He wrote a narrative called Armies of the Night. And he says, this is the book Covert Secrecy, talking about what Mailer talks about those marches. He says, the march on the Pentagon, Mailer asserts, was a protest against the authority because the authority lied. It lied through the teeth of corporation executives and cabinet officials and police enforcement officers and newspaper editors and advertising agencies and in its mass magazines. The quote-unquote authority and the corporation are Mailer's shorthand for a vast apparatus of media structures, corporate interests and state institutions whose headquarters is the Pentagon, but which also includes the CIA, the FBI and even the Warren Commission being the investigation into JFK's assassination. The chief effect of this apparatus is a national state of suppressed schizophrenia, a contradiction between religious fervour and technological rationality, which makes the average good Christian American secretly love the war in Vietnam. So I think that's what saying that this ideal of what America is this coalition or conspiracy between governments, corporations, the media, in order to spin a story, a narrative over a fiction over what is actually going on. Which, if you think about Trump and post-truth and all of that, and the way people spout stuff on social media and sort of invent things that are to try and score points. But disregarding what's really going on. So it's that whole thing of trying to make people support the war by spinning all of these fictions. And I think that's what Seconds is railing against, is that we're trying to say that it's not over, that everything that is going on, there's all this stuff going on in the world, there's all this heartbreak and horror and there's a reason why you don't feel like, it's almost like you feel Arthur Hamilton feels this emptiness because it's almost like it's not earned. That even though he went to war and he fought, we assume he went into war and he fought that, it's not that you're living a lie you're living this fantasy based on propped up by lies and avoiding the truth.
Yeah, and I think that he's bought into the fiction and now he maybe just doesn't want to confront the fact that it is a lie, and so he just wants to try again. It's like, if I just do it again, that'll work this time. But he says, towards the end, that the whole thing is that the choices are always being made for him, that he never gets to make the choices himself. But it's also interesting to think, like, I didn't even think about the fact that, the Vietnam War was happening, civil rights. But
civil rights, yeah.
Arthur Hamilton, he's the kind of person, he would not have been involved in any of this. This all would have passed him by. I mean, you get it now. People who are like, I don't like politics, and that's such a privileged position where the political situation doesn't affect you at all. Whereas other people, if you're not a middle class white guy, these things affect you. But if you are, then you get to just go through life and not ever have to really engage with these things. Also, the fact that this comes out in 1966, so it's kind of slightly maybe before the counterculture kind of hippie thing really takes off. That's 67, 68. And then it's all kind of over by 1970 because you get, Woodstock, the celebration, and then you've got Altamont where, the Hells Angels are the security, and a man gets stabbed. You've got the Manson murders and so on. So it's kind of the death of the hippie dream. And this is just kind of before that. And you see that when Hamilton becomes Wilson and he meets Nora, and they go to this weird like bacchanalian celebration where there's all this grapes put in a vat and everyone takes their clothes off and they're squashing the grapes, and you can see that Wilson, now played by Rock Hudson, is looking around as going, I don't know what to do. And you can tell he kind of wants to be a part of it, but then is also like, no, I can't. I couldn't possibly. And then he finally just becomes involved with it. But I kind of think it's interesting in that the fact that, he still ends up being dissatisfied with this new life. That in many ways, like, the fact that Arthur Hamilton becomes Tony Wilson and Tony Wilson is played by Rock Hudson, the whole idea that, you get this, John Randolph, is it? John Randolph, who plays Arthur Hamilton at the beginning, very just ordinary looking man. And he becomes a Rock Hudson, chiseled, good looking, handsome, masculine ideal of that time. Very, I guess, kind of like makes you think of like John Hamm's Don Draper in Mad Men. But like in Mad Men, he's also, I think he's already maybe a bit too old for what's coming. Like, so I guess like Rock Hudson at this point, he was a big star and he was in all those like comedies like Pillow Talk with Doris Day. So he was still part of like he's before this new kind of generation that are about to come and really change things up and shake things up and reject everything that becomes before them. So it's interesting that even like so he's Arthur Hamilton's 51. He becomes Tony Wilson, who I'm assuming is maybe in his 30s, and it's almost like he maybe is already like still too old, especially with what's about to come. That it is going to be the new generation. So I just always find it interesting, the fact that it comes out 66. It's kind of maybe just before the real kind of social change. I mean, the social change is happening, but it really doesn't become so kind of marked that this generation gap really becomes so evident. That it's really interesting that Wilson, I think, is just before this new generation. And so he's maybe the fact that if he was to try again, if he was actually allowed to try again, it seems like he would have to almost be, I don't know, younger, I don't know, but it's just interesting, the placement of the film, how it's just on this verge. And also I looked up that another film that came out the same year, 1966, going back to our first episode where we looked at Paul Morrissey's Flesh for Frankenstein. The first film that Morrissey did kind of with Andy Warhol, Chelsea Girls, comes out in 1966. And you think about like that's the beginning of like the counter culture and like independent film, like American film. So, already in the 60s you've got all like the French New Wave, and then it's really coming over. You're seeing it in like the work that Morrissey and Warhol are doing. It's really, really kind of interestingly placed in 1966, I think.
Yeah, but also Rock Hudson lived a double life himself, didn't he? Because he was gay and couldn't reveal that to the world and things like that. So there was a lot of interesting things going on, sort of a meta narrative going on there as well.
And and the fact that he was still part of that kind of Hollywood system. So, a year after this film is made, Bonnie and Clyde comes out and The Graduate. And that's the beginning in Americans. That's kind of the death knell of the old classical Hollywood studio system is happening. It's also, so in the 60s, Hollywood films, a lot of the big Hollywood films, they're flopping because they're so out of touch with this new generation and what they want from their films, especially if they're seeing all these films from from France and from all around the world, all the new waves and things like that. And Rock Hudson, I think, is kind of one of the last group of that classical Hollywood film star and, you know, being controlled by studios. And I believe at one point, you know, the fact that he was a gay man, a closeted gay man. And I think at one point they pretty much, I think the studio made him marry a woman. And I think it was like his secretary or a secretary or something. So he was forced into this marriage that was fake, which again is makes you think like, yeah, the whole thing of like, I guess.
No wonder the story spoke to him then. Yeah, and I mean, there's also other aspects to the cast as well, that a lot of actors in the film were blacklisted during the communist witch hunts in Hollywood, which at that point the blacklist was over, but I think they were all like, he knew all these guys and because he was a bit of a lefty himself, at least at the time. I mean, he was friends with JFK and RFK and all of those guys. So I think, yeah, he knew all of these guys and was giving them another crack at being in films and stuff, even though, you know, he wasn't going to get in trouble for doing it. But it's like, I think it was a realization. I don't think he did it without realizing it. I think it was very purposeful. So you're saying it's like, you know, the next year Bonnie and Clyde comes out. I think Seconds feels much more like part of that new wave of Hollywood films than it does of the old guard. I think Frankenheimer is, in a way, a godfather to the Godfather, if you want to put it that way. Like, I think he's one of those American filmmakers who was inspired all those guys that came after. In fact, I think Bonnie and Clyde was directed by Arthur Penn. Wasn't he originally the director of The Train? He was, and then John Frankenheimer ended up directing that, which is another great 60s Frankenheimer film with Burt Lancaster.
Kind of made it within the midst of this trilogy, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. And so I think he exists in that crossover period. And I think, along with people like Sam Fuller and these other guys I think they were real inspirations to the Coppola and Scorsese and Spielberg and all these guys. They were working within the Hollywood system, or at least adjacent to it, and making these very interesting films in the 60s.
Yeah, and also he comes from television, and I guess you also have Sidney Lumet, who comes from television as well, and he's kind of, I think he's slightly, I mean, he becomes part of that like 70s New Hollywood, although I think Sidney Lumet may have been a little bit older. But yeah, I think, the thing about this film is it does seem like an art film. Like he must have been seeing all these, like French New Wave films and things like that. There's different points where there are kind of jump cuts, and there's all these, like, just from the beginning of the film, there's these weird, like use of wide-angle lenses, fisheye lenses,
distorted mirrors, like
and also that the weird. So near the very beginning of the film, there's this weird shot of Arthur Hamilton where it's like the camera's kind of tethered to him or mounted on him, and so he kind of he remains in the middle of the frame, and everything around him as he walks jumps up and down. And I looked it up, and it's called Snorri Cam. Yeah.
I was looking that up too.
Yeah, but it creates a weird effect. And from the very first shots of the film, it is weird, and it's disorienting and unsettling, and things look really distorted.
And there's all the just like Funhouse Mirror opening credits, which are all by Saul Bass as well.
Yeah.
So like a guy from the marketing, like he was from marketing and commercials, and I guess I don't know what they called it. It's like a graphic design. You know, he did the opening credits for Psycho. Like I think if you're getting Saul Bass, you're linked into that like New York like art scene. The cinematography is James Wong Howe, one of the great cinematographers of Hollywood of all time, not just the 50s and 60s. He did Sweet Smell of Success, Bell, Book and Candle, just phenomenal. One of the greatest black and white, the greatest black and white cinematographers of Hollywood. Jerry Goldsmith does the music. The music is extremely unsettling. Like you get his music with Saul Bass's visuals at the very beginning of the film. You're completely thrown for a loop. You don't even know what this film's going to be about. And I think that's why I bounced off it at first, because Frankenheimer's known for his muscular thrillers and his action movies. And then he does this out of left field just bizarre, surreal.
It is an art film.
Yeah, art film. And it's great.
And it's also interesting at the time. I mean, the whole Paranoia trilogy and The Train as well. Frankenheimer's using black and white, and by the 60s, that was a choice.
Yeah.
That's a choice. That most films around this time are in color, and he's still working with black and white. And then with all these 60s black and white films that he makes, they all just look amazing. But I also think that one of the reasons maybe why they use the black and white is because when you first see Arthur Hamilton in surgery, they used real footage of a surgery, and apparently one of the cameramen like fainted or something.
Yeah, and Frankenheimer had to shoot it himself.
Yeah. And you can imagine that you would not get away with real surgery footage if it was in color.
Yeah. And also I think but that aspect of it, as well as, there's a lot of handheld, especially at the beginning, there's a lot of handheld camera when he's walking through the train station. Apparently they used a Playboy bunny to do like a dance to distract people in the station so they could film the shots without people like going, oh, look, there's a camera, and pointing at the camera. And I think that's like a documentary approach, and with the real surgery and stuff, really, because I think it really grounds the film. Like after the weird opening sequence, he wants to really ground you in reality before pulling the rug out from underneath you. And apparently the Wilson's Malibu Beach house is Frankenheimer's actual house. So like he's using these real life aspects to ground the film, so the fantastical elements feel a bit more realistic. I mean, we haven't even talked about the weird organization that is doing all of this. Like they're just this very, but I have in my notes benign malevolence.
But then they're also they're a corporation, and so you have that they're selling a product. So the whole thing is that what they're doing is a money-making exercise. And it reminded me back to our last episode where we looked at RoboCop and the whole thing of like what is the robot in the first robot? Ed 209, and how they were like, it's shit, but we're just going to keep making it.
Yeah.
And they realized that part of the corporation, the way they work is that once people get into it, they make them find someone else to be involved. And then they basically blackmail people to buy the product. And then they use their dissatisfied customers for their cadaver procurement service.
Yeah.
So it's this cyclical thing.
Yeah.
So it's all this cycle of consumption, production, but producing this failed product, because it's the whole thing. Like you realize towards the end, pretty much everyone who goes through this ends up coming back to them and going, no, I don't like this.
Yeah.
Can I do it again? So all those men in the waiting room are waiting to go through the thing again. And then we realize at the end that they're being killed to be the cadavers for the next round. So you're having this corporation that are, so using surgery as a means to make money, but also to produce this product that no one actually wants.
No. They convince you that you want it and then make it so you can't back out of it.
Yeah.
It's a scam.
Yes.
And that's capitalism, right?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so there's that aspect to all of this as well, that it's not just like that they've been sold a lie, and so it's this critique of American capitalist society and also it's showing that this is what they use. They use the lie and they use the failure to sell you more stuff. That they're always, I guess, trying to sell you the solution or if you just do this or if you just buy this, then everything will be okay. And it's never going to be okay under this capitalist system. The whole idea of the corporation and the man who's the older man, he's really interesting.
Yeah, because he's so sweet, but yet he's like the devil on your shoulder. He's the devil on the Faustian bargain.
Yeah, and he's just this nice old man, and at the beginning Arthur's like, I don't know why I'm telling you this, and he's like, no, yes, and but he's also the closer. Like at first he doesn't want to buy the product, and they're like, send the old man in.
Yeah,
and then as he's talking or making Hamilton talk, he then brings out the contract and goes, just sign it. Yeah, it's really interesting. Like that what you said about the benign. It's benign
malevolence.
Benign malevolence definitely is happening. What I find really, again, another really interesting thing about 1966 and this film coming out that year is that the same year another film comes out from Japan, The Face of Another, which we just watched as well, directed by Hiroshi Teshigahara. And in that film, you have a man who is disfigured at work. It's like some kind of chemical thing happens, and he's completely disfigured. His face is all, he's got kind of pretty much no face. And he's offered this solution, which is what is referred to as a mask that he can wear that looks like an actual face. And so it's really interesting to see that, within the same year in different parts of the world, this story is being told. But what's interesting about Seconds, I found, is that that's all about the lack of choice and how, they're realizing that you have no choice in this system. And The Face of Another, in conversation with this man, and his surgeon who gives him this mask to wear. And he's like, by having this mask, is it changing you? And it's this whole idea of like, it's what matters. Yourself or your identity is what's inside, and that your face or your looks don't define who you are. But yet this whole idea of like with this mask that he can become someone else or almost become invisible. And so it's weird. The Face of Another is almost like too much freedom. Like as the film goes along, he starts acting more and more kind of outlandish ways. And it's more like with The Invisible Man, the whole thing of like, if you become invisible, it brings out the worst in you, that you become almost insane because you can do anything. You don't have that responsibility. And as we were watching the film, it just made me think about, what happens to people when they're anonymous online. So it was just interesting that Seconds was about lack of choice. And then in The Face of Another was the flip side, where if you have too much freedom, do you immediately kind of go towards, just acting out whatever you want to do?
Well, I think it's in Seconds, it's about like he's given this freedom where he can just live this life of luxury, but without that, you kind of become, who are you even? Like you don't even have this. If you're just sitting around painting, you've got no one to talk to. You've got nothing else. You're just an idle person, not doing anything. Are you still a person if you've got nothing going on? And then in Face of Another, it's that thing where it's like he becomes this other person. The freedom for him allows him to act out and do these things. Like he wants to, because I think he goes to that apartment building and rents two apartments, one as his other self and one as his regular self. And then it also parallels it with that beautiful woman who's also disfigured, and she's shunned by people on the street and all these sorts of things, and she's trying to find her place in the world. It's interesting parallel.
Yeah, and also, I think there's World War II connections that you think about.
It's very overt in
Face because it has to do with the fact, obviously, Japan was bombed, nuclear bomb, and there would have been people who were kind of disfigured from the radiation, and there's these weird German references throughout the film. They always go drinking in this German beer hall, and at one point, with the young woman, there's all this. I think it's like Hitler. You hear the voice of Hitler. It's a very, very interesting. Yeah, it's like Seconds, and that it's very much an art film, but with these kind of horror elements. But it's just really interesting that these two films, the same year, really, really strong connections. But did you know about, like you mentioned before, the Frankenheimer connection to the Kennedys? That the whole thing with RFK and like his assassination?
No.
Okay, so I just found out. Yeah, you mentioned how the home in the film is Frankenheimer's actual home. I think it's in Malibu on the beach. Robert F. Kennedy stayed there the night before his assassination. He was staying with John Frankenheimer.
Frankenheimer was there when it happened.
I don't know if he took him there, but apparently he was waiting at the Ambassador Hotel to take him back to that home.
Yeah.
And they saw Sirhan being taken out, and then found out that Robert F. Kennedy had been shot. And of course, the whole thing with Sirhan is that he basically said he was essentially a Manchurian candidate. So
that's wild.
Yeah, so I think John Frankenheimer supposedly had always been very, very liberal. He had a very conservative father he was clashed with. And supposedly he withdrew from a lot of politics after that. So it's so weird that he was so connected to these events, and his films are as well.
He was tapping into something there.
He did such amazing work in the 1960s. And then I don't even know if it's kind of after this event, like his films, he never really reaches those heights. I mean, I know that you're all for Ronin, which is great, but that's one of very few examples. I kind of feel like after this real high point that he has in the 60s, which is sad.
I think he did. I don't think his films he made, but so after that, the 60s really have the same impact. I mean, I think he still made quite a few, but I don't think they really made as much of an impression as, there's films that are cult favourites, I'm sure, but not in this sort of at this level.
Like the run in the 60s was like Manchurian Candidate, 7 Days in May, The Train, Seconds.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like we're missing something else. I don't know, but it is incredible run. And coming at the end of this classical Hollywood period, and just as they're going into this new Hollywood, he's really at this transitional point. There's him. It's really quite remarkable. Shall we move on to our honourable mentions?
Yeah.
All right. Do you want to go first, or shall I?
I can go. My inevitable X-Files reference. There's not a lot. It's funny, there's not a lot of really diabolical surgery sort of stuff going on. I was looking up the episode guides trying to think. But there is one in the first season which it does link, I think. It's called Young at Heart, which is about... the backstory is that when Mulder first joins the FBI, one of his first major cases is tracking down a serial killer who gets him put away, he goes to prison, and presumably it dies. I can't remember if he's executed by the state or if he just dies. But then in the story of the episode, it turns out that he might have come back from the dead, and the reason for it is because there was a prison doctor who was doing experiments on reversing the aging process, and they even the bad guy has his hand chopped off, and they use salamander DNA to regrow his hand, so he has this weird webbed hand. But the whole thing is that he's back from the dead because of this surgeon who has done operations on him in order to basically bring him back from the dead and make him young again. And he goes on a tear and goes and leaves notes for Mulder along the way. It's like a riff on the serial killer. FBI agent chasing a serial killer storyline, but it's with the man who's been experimented upon in order to become younger. So that's my X-Files drop for this episode.
Yeah, I mean, for me, honourable mentions. I mean, I guess we really can't pass by the work of David Cronenberg, who I'm sure we're just going to have to do a whole episode about him at some point. I mean, I'm thinking just across his whole filmography, you've got Rabid, The Fly, Crash, Dead Ringers, and Crimes of the Future, one of his most recent films. They all have surgical elements to them, and this whole idea of surgery and modern technology modifying the body, creating, you've got new... like with Rabid, you've got kind of new appendages, and in Crash, you've got new orifices kind of created through, this use of like surgery and the body, and how also the changing and modification of the body also changes in many ways our perceptions of reality. you've got the surgeons or the gynecologists in Dead Ringers creating their instruments for like mutated women but also, certainly Crimes of the Future. The whole thing of like surgery is the new sex.
Yeah.
So the whole thing of surgical means, technological means of changing the human body, or Cronenberg often said that a lot of his films are hypotheses about the future of humanity or the future of the human body. So you really can't go past the work of David Cronenberg.
Well, I'm just gonna throw it out there and say John Woo's Face Off.
Of course.
It's the name of the episode. I mean, we have to talk about that. It's his greatest American film, in my opinion. And for those who don't know, it's John Travolta and Nicolas Cage swap faces and shoot a bunch of stuff. It's a funny old film. And it's such a wild concept that just they lean into very heavily. And I suppose it doesn't really. The whole aspect of identity and stuff, I guess, is implied, but it's not really. It's all really just an excuse for shenanigans, really. And it's a chance for these actors who are sort of at the top of their game around this time, 96, 97, to just ham it up and to play these two different characters. And it's great fun.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people talk about like Nicolas Cage and his acting and how he goes over the top and stuff. Like John Travolta is really good in this too, when he's the villain pretending to be the cop. They match each other. They're at this. They really do. They're all both hamming it up, something fierce, and they really match each other. And it's a really great pairing of these two actors.
Yeah. All right. Moving on. So, as much as part of me wants to pick Boxing Helena, I'm not. I'm going to go for something a bit more classy. Lucille Hadjihalilovic, I think is how you say her name. I don't know if I'm saying it correct. She made a film called Evolution. Really, really strange film. I can't remember when it came out. It was probably around 2014, 15. I should have looked it up. But it's about this. Is it almost like an island? It has been a while since I've seen the film, but it is almost like this island, and there are these little boys who live there, and they're attended to by these women, these young women, and the women all kind of look very similar. It's almost like they're nurses or nannies. So they're caring for these young boys, but then these boys are then being taken into this surgery, and it almost seems like they're using these boys as like incubators or like implanting them with like, I don't know, new babies or like fetuses or something. It's a very really odd film, really beautiful. I think definitely you can see, because it's a French film, some connection back to Franju and Eyes Without a Face, that it is this in many ways not gory, but like to do with like body and surgery, but there's this strange poetic feeling to it all, and there's this beauty, and you definitely aren't really given any answers as to what's going on, where this is, what kind of world this is. But I think by just plunging you into this kind of strange experience, I think it's a really, really beautiful film that hasn't really been talked about that much. So I definitely wanted to kind of highlight Evolution.
Yeah, it's a great film.
Yeah.
This one, it's not really diabolical surgery, I suppose, but with all these people changing their faces, it made me think about Darkman. Sam Raimi's odd superhero film with Liam Neeson, and which is all about this revolutionary technology, isn't it? Where you can, and he changes faces a lot in that movie. And that's just a wild ride. And I was just thinking about, weirdly enough, it just made me think of that with the face of another, because he creates this fake face based on the template of the real person. And it just made me think, about how, because Liam Neeson's character gets all burnt up in the explosion by the bad guys, and it's all about him wanting to return back to the life that he had with Frances McDormand, and so using his scientific abilities to try and recapture that while also getting revenge on those who tried to kill him.
So my final pick relates to a article that I wrote on Mad Science Cinema using a Sardian approach, which also relates back to the work that I did in my PhD. So I wrote an article called Dr. Desard, and it's part of a book called Transnational Horror Across Visual Media, Fragmented Bodies. It's edited by Dana Ock and Christian Strayer. And so in that article, I talk briefly about Eyes Without a Face. I also talk about Faceless, the film by Jess Franco, and the other main film that I talk about. So I wanted to class things up with my choice of evolution, and now I'm going to do the opposite of that and mention Human Centipede. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we've mentioned, that a lot of the mad scientist figures often goes back to like Nazi doctors and the figure of Dr. Mengele. And definitely in the first Human Centipede film, you have this mad scientist, this mad surgeon who wants to create, a human centipede. So he kidnaps two young American tourists who are touring around Europe. And also he's kidnapped a Japanese man, and he decides to sew them together. So they're sewed from mouth to anus. And so you end up with this 3-person human centipede. The films were, very controversial, very notorious. Human Centipede 2 in particular got banned all over the place. But the first Human Centipede film, it is about this, it's all about the surgeon who is just absolutely mad. And it's not about improving humans. It's all about degrading them. So a lot of people, just were really turned off by these films, and totally get it, because it is just a focus on the base and disgusting, to the point where everything really is reduced to shit, because there is this whole thing of like, at some point, the front part of the human centipede is going to have to shit, and they shit directly into the mouth of the next part of a human centipede. So it obviously was the writer-director Tom Six. He really wanted to push things as far as you could go. The fact that it's this whole idea of this very, very diabolical surgery, the most diabolical surgery I think you can come across. So, I wrote an academic piece about Human Centipede, it's available out there. But even though you would think when you hear about Human Centipede, it's just like, this is just gross and obscene, and what value at all is there in this? There are actually some really interesting things going on in the film, I actually would argue. I'm going to end on that note. Human Centipede.
Well, I think that puts a pin in things. That's episode 4. The Doctor is out.
Yep.
The Doctor was in, the Doctor is out.
Yep. All right. See you next time.
Yes. As always, you can find us on social medias, on Instagram, Facebook, Letterboxd, Bluesky, and at scifrightspodcast@gmail.com if you want to get in touch. So until next time.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.